Yeah, that's right, I just appeared out of nowhere, but you've seen nothing yet. Of course I can do magic. I'm a leprechaun. Didn't you hear my accent? You mean you didn't believe me? How dare you be so skeptical of the Sceptical Leprechaun? I'm hurt. But anyway, let's get on with the show. If we can.
Alright, Sceptical Leprechaun, you're live in 3, 2, 1, action!
Konnichiwa YouTubers, I am the Sceptical Leprechaun, and welcome to the channel where we get drunk on reason. In my last video, we discussed the Kalam Cosmological argument as presented by William Lane Craig. We saw that this argument has become one of the most popular defences deployed by theists in the world today. But does it stand up to scrutiny? Does it prove that the universe has a cause? And more specifically, does it get theists any closer to proving the existence of the divine? With these questions in mind, what follows in this video is a deconstruction of the various flaws and fallacies contained within Craig's iteration of the argument. So if you're ready, let's jump right in and take a look at premise 1. Premise 1 states the following: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Needless to say, this statement appeals to our common sense, but if there's one thing I've learned whilst studying philosophy and the nature of fallacious reasoning, it's that our common sense is not necessarily the best pathway to truth. So despite how intuitive Craig's first premise might be, it is in fact flawed. First and foremost, it's important to point out that premise 1 is an assertion. An assertion is a claim for which no evidence has been provided. And as my personal hero Christopher Hitchens once put it, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed as such. Yet, despite the assertive nature of Craig's first premise, there will be many of you watching who will assume that my rejection of it is pedantic at best. After all, is it not fair to conclude that existent things have causes? Throughout the entirety of human history, we have yet to discover something that's uncaused. The sheer size of the set of caused things, combined with our inability to discover anything that's uncaused, must be counted as evidence towards the fact that existent things have causes. Sounds reasonable, right? In answering this charge, a brief note on inductive arguments will suffice. Inductive reasoning is a logical process in which multiple premises, all believed true or found true most of the time, are combined to obtain a specific conclusion. In other words, inductive reasoning involves taking what we have observed in the majority of cases and applying it predictively to the question at hand. For example, all of the cats that I have observed have had fur. Tomorrow I am going on holidays to Canada. Therefore, the cats I see in Canada will probably have fur. The third line of this argument gives us knowledge, but it can only be probably true. In fact, until relatively recently in history, this conclusion would probably have been true in every case. But in the 1970s, breeders developed a furless cat known as the Canadian Sphinx, thereby weakening the conclusion of this argument. Those damn scientists messing with nature! Who do they think they are? God! I'm so frustrated I think I need my inhaler! Hey you there, the angry asthmatic. It's interesting that you complain about scientists interfering with nature when it comes to cats and other animals, but you're quite happy for scientists to interfere with nature to provide you with your asthma pump. If the natural order were to prevail, you'd just have bad breathing, right? You may not even be alive. I think I detect some hypocrisy. In any case, the Sphinx example, while trivial, demonstrates the potential problem with inductive reasoning. Just because everything in the universe that we have successfully explained thus far has been found to have had some cause, does not mean that the universe itself has a cause. Similar to the Sphinx, the universe might be an exception. Suffice to say, inductive reasoning is probabilistic in nature and does not offer certain conclusions. But the Kalam argument is guilty of more than mere inductive reasoning. After all, its conclusion is not a probabilistic proclamation. As William Lane Craig put it himself.
Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows.
As you can see here, Craig claims that due to the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a claim of certainty. But again, many of you may believe that this claim is justified. Just because one can find rare exceptions to our observations, a la the Sphinx, does not mean that the seemingly universal applicability of cause and effect is invalidated. To put it another way, it would be silly to exempt the universe from the nature of cause and effect, just because inductive arguments lead to flawed conclusions in the case of rare exceptions. Again, this sounds fair, right?
But unfortunately, it is wrong.
What you have just heard, ladies and gentlemen, is a textbook Black Swan fallacy. The Black Swan fallacy is an inductive fallacy that states that if something has not occurred within the speaker's experience, it cannot occur. In other words, the fallacy states that just because something has always been a certain way in the speaker's experience, it is always that way as a matter of universal principle. The fallacy gets its name from the anecdote wherein a person claims that only white swans exist, simply because they have never observed a swan of a differing colour. To clarify this point, here's an excerpt of atheist, public speaker, debater, and all-round intellectual heavyweight, Matt Dillahunty.
So let's start with the Black Swan fallacy. If you were to try to put it in language that would describe a fallacy, it would be that because we have only observed white swans, there are no black swans. That is fallacious reasoning, which we'll talk about exactly why in a minute. The reason it's so important is because we discovered black swans, showing that this reasoning was false, even though we should have known that the reasoning is false anyway. The mere fact that you haven't observed something doesn't mean that it's not real. The fact that something hasn't happened within your experience doesn't mean that it's not possible.
As Dillahunty so gracefully puts it, the fact that something hasn't happened within one's experience doesn't mean that it's impossible. Applying this to the Kalam Cosmological argument, one can see an obvious example of this kind of reasoning. Craig wants us to accept, on the basis that we have never observed an uncaused entity, that therefore the universe has a cause. In other words, because we have never observed a black swan, therefore only white swans exist. Needless to say, this reasoning is fallacious in the extreme, and as such, we cannot accept Craig's conclusion. At this point, some of you will have concluded that I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Rather than accepting the simple inductive conclusion that existent things have causes, I'm denouncing and abandoning inductive logic altogether. Yet, inductive reasoning has its place in the scientific method. Scientists use it to form hypotheses and theories. So if scientists can use inductive arguments to form conclusions and answer questions, why can't theists do the same? The difference here is simple. Scientists use inductive reasoning to form probabilistic conclusions within our universe. Theists are guilty of applying this same methodology beyond the boundaries of our universe, where our reason and the simple nature of causality breaks down. To explain this point, here's an excerpt of renowned theoretical physicist Dr. Sean Carroll.
The universe is different than our everyday experience. That doesn't sound like a surprising statement, but we really need to take it to heart. To look at a modern cosmological model and say, yes, but what was the cause? It's like looking at someone taking pictures with an iPhone and saying, but where does the film go? It's not that the answer is difficult or inscrutable, it's completely the wrong question to be asking. Why should we expect that there are causes or explanations or reason why in the universe in which we live? It's because the physical world inside of which we're embedded has two important features. There are unbreakable patterns, laws of physics. Things don't just happen, they obey the laws. And there is an arrow of time stretching from the past to the future. The entropy was lower in the past, increases toward the future. Therefore, when you find some event or state of affairs B today, we can very often trace it back in time to one or a couple of possible predecessor events that we therefore call the cause of that, which leads to be according to the laws of physics. But crucially, Both of these features of the universe that allow us to speak the language of causes and effects are completely absent when we talk about the universe as a whole. We don't think that our universe is part of a bigger ensemble that obeys laws. Even if it's part of the multiverse is not part of a bigger ensemble that obeys laws. Therefore, nothing gives us the right to demand some kind of external cause. The idea that our intuitions about cause and effect that we get from the everyday experience of the world in this room should somehow be extended without modification to the fundamental nature of reality is fairly absurd.
As you can see, and as Carol infers, inductive reasoning is grossly inappropriate when applied beyond the boundaries of our universe. Taking this into consideration, Craig's attempt to demonstrate that the universe conforms to the same rules that operate within it is simply unjustified. Contrary to the typical theistic charge, atheists are not guilty of criticising Craig for using inductive reasoning while permitting it in other spheres. Rather, Craig is guilty of assuming that inductive reasoning applies in the first place. But let's suppose that we accept the argument as it is. Let's assume that the conclusion is true. The universe has a cause. How do we know that this cause is the god of classical theism? Craig reasons that because the cause of the universe would have to exist outside it, and therefore exist outside of space and time, that this cause must be a spaceless, timeless, and immaterial being. To explain this reasoning more fully, here's an excerpt of Craig himself.
Now, from the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. There are only two possible candidates that could fit such a description. Either an abstract object like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. And therefore it follows logically that the transcendent cause of the universe is an unembodied mind.
As you can see, Craig concludes that the only possible candidate for a first cause is an unembodied mind. But this is flawed for a number of reasons. First of all, Craig's claim that the cause of our universe must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being is simply an assertion. There are, in fact, numerous possibilities. To elucidate on the nature of these possibilities, here's an excerpt of the brilliant and rather eloquent British chemist Peter Atkins.
There are two kinds of beginning, and it's important to distinguish them. One type of beginning is when an already existing universe gives rise to a daughter universe. Another type of a beginning is when absolutely nothing turns into a universe. I should call that latter universe an original universe. Did that original universe, although perhaps contingent, have to be caused? You have to realize that physical laws, which are summaries of observed behavior, come into existence as a universe comes into existence. That includes issues of causality. It is naive in the extreme to extrapolate our own experience of causality to an era before those laws existed. It is entirely possible that the unique event that marked the inception of the physical laws was itself an uncaused event.
As Atkins explains, it's entirely possible that our universe is a daughter universe, or indeed that our universe is uncaused altogether. With these points in mind, Craig's assertion that an unembodied mind is necessary is at best a premature conclusion. Furthermore, Craig is guilty of committing an argument from ignorance fallacy. This is the fallacy of assuming the truth of a conclusion based on the lack of evidence to the contrary. This is apparent when Craig states that the cause of the universe must be immaterial. Craig's use of the word must tells us nothing other than he is unable to think of any other possibilities. But as Atkins demonstrates, there are other possibilities. The short answer is that we simply do not know the answer yet. But that's okay, scientists are working on it. And let me tell you this, if I was going to put money on who's going to discover the answer first, let's just say that William Lane Craig is at the bottom of my list. Suffice to say, Craig's claim is nothing more than a baseless assertion founded upon a bedrock of ignorance. The second problem with Craig's claim that an unembodied mind is the cause of our universe is this. There is simply no evidence to indicate that minds can exist absent a brain. Although Craig's thinking on this subject tells us at the very least that human beings can exist without a brain. Needless to say, all of the available evidence seems to suggest that minds are an emergent property of the brain. For example, head injuries that result in brain damage often alter the personality, memories, and other aspects of the injured person. Is it merely a coincidence that brain injuries are correlated with these mental and psychological impacts? I think not. But even if we had no evidence or explanation pertaining to minds, Craig would be no closer to demonstrating the existence of an unembodied mind. His assertion still needs to meet its burden of proof. Simply claiming that an unembodied mind exists doesn't make it so. The final issue with Craig's argument, even if we accept its conclusion, is that it doesn't lead directly to a theistic God. Even if we accept Craig's assertion that an unembodied mind is responsible for causing the universe, who's to say that that mind is the God of the Bible? Maybe the Hindus are right and it's the mind of the supreme being Brahman. What's more, this unembodied mind could be a deistic God who doesn't even exist anymore. To clarify this point, here's Matt Dillahunty once again.
They reached the conclusion that there has to have been this being in order to start everything off. But that in and of itself doesn't mean that that being still exists, because that being could have ceased to exist at the moment of creation. It would satisfy their argument, which is already fallacious in the first place, or it's not sufficient to convince you. So the only thing they could ever hope to prove is that once upon a time, prior to the beginning, there was this thing. They cannot prove that it's still there. And this, but Craig...
It's basically saying the universe is eternal, right?
Well, Craig and others have gone down this route a little bit to point out that this God is required to sustain the universe as well. And that's something you have to hold their feet to the fire on, because all of this just gets back to, oh, well, we can't imagine it would work any other way. I can't imagine how it would work any other way. And that's what they all boil down to.
As Dillahunty points out, there is absolutely no reason to assume, even if we accept Craig's argument in its entirety, that this first cause still exists. And for those of you who may buy into the idea that the universe requires a sustainer, a brief quote from 18th century mathematician and scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace will suffice. The theory works without that assumption. To summarise, the Kalam Cosmological argument fails for no less than 6 reasons. First, it asserts, without evidence, that everything which begins to exist has a cause. Second, it commits the Black Swan fallacy. Third, it assumes the applicability of inductive reasoning beyond the boundaries of our universe. Fourth, Craig is guilty of limiting the potential options and committing an argument from ignorance fallacy. Fifth, Craig is guilty of asserting that minds can exist absent a brain. And sixth, on the assumption that such a mind exists, Craig is guilty of assuming that this mind is not only the God of classical theism, but the God of the Bible more specifically. In conclusion, it is simply too early and our understanding too poor to conclude that the universe has a cause. But still, many of you may be thinking, despite my attempt to convince you otherwise, that to reject the idea that the universe has a cause is perverse, especially when one considers the discovery of the Big Bang. But if you are thinking in this way, it's safe to assume that your understanding of Big Bang cosmology is flawed. But don't take my word for it. Here's another excerpt of theoretical physicist Dr. Sean Carroll, wherein he clarifies this point.
A lot of cosmologists will say there was a beginning. And the problem with this is that the prediction that there's a beginning, or the understanding that there's a beginning, is based on general relativity, and we know general relativity is not right. The reason we know it's not right is because, for one thing, it predicts a singularity. It predicts that things are infinite, and we don't think that that can be true. Also, general relativity is not compatible with quantum mechanics, which we do think is right. So basically, we have a prediction that the universe began based on a theory we have no right to trust. So the right answer is, we don't know yet.
As Carroll explains, we simply do not know the answer. The cause of our universe, or lack thereof, is yet to be explained. What's more, I'm not convinced that William Lane Craig knows any better. I can only hope that I've convinced you of the same. And that brings us to the end of the video. If you liked it, leave a like. If you didn't, blame God. For anything else, please leave a comment below. I have been the Sceptical Leprechaun. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Slán go fóill.